So, the difficult disciple, today we're talking about the Gnostic um, Paul. So, the charge that Paul's thought was part of the ground rock for Gnosis, for Gnostic thought, had has at this point over a 60-year history in the study of nascent Christianity. However, for our interest in purpose, based on where this study begins, we are beginning with Elaine Pagel's next slide, Karen. Elaine Pagels and her 1978 book, The Gnostic Paul. In this text, she systematized the argument that Paul's thought is proto-Gnostic in the terms that it foretells a lot of the later developments, and in its writings itself, or in the writings themselves, there are elements that would later be construed into more fundamental modes of Gnosticism, and that Paul's writings itself can be considered, in effect, to be Gnostic by her definition. And we'll talk very soon about what that definition is. So, but it wasn't Elaine Pagels alone. So this is the next slide, Karen. But we also have Karen King of Harvard Divinity School. And King is someone who also shares Pagel's ideas that Paul is primarily or very influential upon the Gnostic tradition. And I think at this point, although there are serious questions about what that means to say Paul is a Gnostic, and we'll talk about that very soon, I think by consensus now, most people will acknowledge that Gnosticism is very indebted to Paul in some ways, even though what the later Gnostic readers found in Paul and perhaps what he thought he was presenting are quite different. And I think that that is an important statement to make. That I think that he wrestles with many of the same ideas that many of the early Gnostics did, but I think that at certain points he would find some of their conclusions to be quite surprising and most likely wouldn't have agreed with everything. But nonetheless, these mystic writers who are emerging actually relatively contemporary with Paul, when we talk about Marcion of Sinope, they are finding things in Paul that they find to be thoroughly conducive to their worldview and to their own unique interpretation of the Christian movement. And as I said, in addition to Pagels, we have King here, and she is primarily interested in the Gnostic tradition more generally. This is her 2013, The Gospel of Mary of Magdala, Jesus and the First Woman Apostle, which specifically takes the Gospel of Mary Magdalene as its primary focus. And, she evaluates it quite well. I would say probably the most thorough evaluation of women within the Gnostic movement itself. And as I said, that came out, 2003. It was older than I'd thought. Okay, so in Pagel's book, she notes that Paul's emphasis on inner revelation and dualistic language mirrors late Gnostic thinking. Her analysis makes explicit much of the coded language in Paul's writings, and we're actually not going to be talking about that. That's going to be a different subject, but we are going to talk about the kind of people that Paul believed he was writing for. And notions of the elect are quite important in that discussion, and particularly the phrase pneumatikoi. And we're going to talk about that in the next section. But pneumatikoi, the elect, the enlightened, those who were called. These are the primary groups for which Paul is writing, and he actually is explicit with this in his text. However, over years of the sort of exoteric or mainstream interpretation of Paul, a lot of that has been dummied down, you might say. So Pagels, she starts there and she says, well, why is Paul using this phrases like elect and the pneumatikoi? And she brings that much forward to the center, and I really think that she's helping us to recall a lot of these early Christian nuances that we don't have currently. As I said, she demonstrated how Paul was forthright in his allusion to hidden or secret teachings. Several times he actually uses this sort of language where he talks about, only someone of the elect or someone open to this kind of information would be able to understand it. And other scholars like Karen King, and there's another one whose name I forgot, started drawing on comparative analysis with Gnostic literature itself, particularly Coptic materials and materials that were not written in Koine. And for this, I would say Jan Bremer's work is very important, who he does a lot with apocalyptic materials. So they brought all of these sort of elements in and set that in conversation with Paul's backstory, his sort of ambiguous identity, his blending of the Hebrew and Greek traditions, which we've discussed, I think, exclusively, or we discussed this a lot in our own study, as well as his categorical reliance on mystical experience to justify the authority of his message. And I hope all of us can remember automatically that Paul repeatedly iterates in his writings that he was an apostle first, called by God. And he uses this in a very unique way because he specifically says, I was not called of men. And that particular accusation was certainly against the leaders of the Jerusalem church. It was against Jesus's earliest disciples and the chief of his disciples, Peter. So when he says that, he's not just talking about, okay, well, I had this experience. No, he's actually saying that my authority as an apostle actually transcends that of those who were called by flesh and blood. And it's really, really interesting that this particular idea sort of has a secondary life in Reformation era discussions about the sacrament, where it says, well, Paul was a greater disciple than Peter because he understood the message of Jesus. In the same way that just being physically present with Jesus would not give you salvation, and neither should the communion or should the presence in the Eucharist. Because after all, even Judas was at the table with Jesus and he did not receive salvation. So that was sort of an interesting just aside. But so this idea, not called of men, and this is part of his reliance on his own mystical experience to justify his position. And finally, we have from several writers, Marcion included, Valentinus amongst others, we have several people who include Paul as one of their own lineage, either as the preserver, as the first transmitter. But we have a lot of people who look at Paul as the beginning of their own traditions. And it's also very important to note that they have very detailed lineages of descent from Paul. Valentinus is perhaps the most serious, where it does seem like one of the major followers of Paul later became a significant conduit for Valentinian gnosis. And that's a very difficult thing to dispute, I would say, especially given the predominance of this particular type of argument. And you actually find in Origen, who's sort of countering the Valentinians himself, that was a really difficult thing because they were descended in a very real sense from Paul and his lineage. But I think before doing anything else, it is perhaps that in this earlier discussion, I think that we should provide a working definition to what exactly is being referred to as Gnosticism. Now, this is my own gloss on a lot of things. So this is my attempt at trying to bring some of those nuanced discussions into our own this evening. So, as I defined it, Gnosticism is commonly defined as a diverse set of ancient religious movements, so not one, many different groups, and that emphasized primarily esoteric inner revelation or gnosis as the key to salvation. Some proponents argued that human beings harbor a divine spark trapped in a flawed material world that was created by an inferior deity known as the Demiurge, whose own history is fascinating and we'll discuss very soon, who is distinct from the hidden transcendent God. So this Demiurge is something different than the transcendent deity. And we'll talk about that, particularly in Gnostic cosmologies that use archanism, or the idea that there were several deities, a one transcendent who was not particularly known, and the others responsible for the creation of the world. And this perspective, that there is a transcendent God and a present one, often results in a type of dualism which presents nature v spirit. And this, connected really to Paul's understanding of the law, is, I would say, one of the key core elements that are the foundation of a lot of second and third century Gnostic movements. And they all rely on a certain type of Pauline logic. And I think it would be difficult to dispute that, especially now that we know the breadth of Gnostic movements throughout the early Christian world and the circulation of their material. I think that there is a certain reason that these materials were easily accepted, especially by pagan Christian converts. And I think that the key element to that is the way that they utilize Paul's thinking, particularly as it relates to law. So it is also an eclectic movement, or movements drawing from several distinct spiritual traditions to make their conclusion. And it's also very important, this last bit is exceptionally important when we understand church hermeneutics. I mean, sorry, not church hermeneutics, but church heresiology, is that in the second and third century, this is the predominant enemy of what would become Orthodox Christianity. So we have Augustine, Origen, Irenaeus. They're all writing predominantly against Gnostic movements, and to various levels of success, really. And so, but we're going to talk about that right now. So now that I have offered some definition of what Gnosticism is, let us turn to Pagels and King's works to try to understand what Gnostics elements they found, and they being specifically Pagels, because her 1978 work really did sort of base the discussion. You know, before that, we were sort of talking about disparate elements. When she sort of put all this together, she had this criteria of interpretation of different elements that she found to be Gnostic in Paul's work and essential to his theological vision. The next slide, Karen. So, yeah, this is it. So we have an emphasis on inner revelation. As I said, I am not a disciple, I'm not an apostle called by men. Secondly, we have a dualism between matter and spirit. And then we have the use of specific phrasing, which is later adopted by Gnostics, but which actually comes from the sort of mystikoi Mediterranean movements that used the language of mystery, election, secret teachings, esoteric sort of phrasing to distinguish elect and unelect. And it's really, really interesting that a lot of Calvinist ideology really focuses on who's the elect and who's the not. But I think that ignoring some of these sort of proto-Gnostic ideas really helps to frame that. The elect is not simply someone who is chosen, like in terms of predestination, but rather someone who possesses an innate capacity to know. And I think that that adds a certain nuance to a lot of that discussion that's not currently taking place. So, and the final thing is that salvation is primarily an inner awakening of some kind. Now, this is not to say at all that Paul is somehow saying that there is not a moral component. That's not. I don't think that's what he's saying. I'm sure Lee and others would would bristle at that particular interpretation, because there were Christians who are called antinomian or hypernomian, who believe that a certain understanding of the gospel makes you immune to prescribed moral behavior. I don't think Paul had that view. In fact, when we read in the Corinthians, who he's also distinguishing right there, he's talking about between elect and unelect, also doubles down on their need to have a moral predisposition and not living riotously and with various kinds. So I'm not saying that he's trying to say that there is no external element. But I think that when you look at the history of the church, particularly in relation with antinomianism, there is something to this. And Luther's point, uh, which is also very subtle, is that yeah, he even goes to the point that says, yes, for the elect, there is the potential to live without sin and to live above this. However, because we are communal creatures, we still have an obligation to keep our brother from sinning, also using Paul's language. So there were very levels of this. There were very strong levels of this interpretation. And I think that that's because there is a certain theological case that you can make from Paul's writings that having faith in the resurrection does nullify, in some sense, the following of prescribed moral rules. So these elements that we have here are what we can clearly garner from Paul's authentic writings, and they show his familiarity with both the Jewish apocalypse movements as well as his understanding of the language of the mystikoi, so people who practiced Greek religion in terms of the initiatic traditions. It is important that also in this moment, so we are going to rely on this certain dichotomy between orthodox and Gnostic. I'm required to sort of present this in a way that's understandable. So I'm using these binaries. But so now that I've said all these things, I also want to go back and try to say that although this sort of dichotomy between Orthodox and Gnostic does develop, it's also not occurring all at one time, or that there was a universal consensus. And if we can go to the next slide, Karen. And this is exemplified by this particular piece of information, which comes from, it was only discovered in the year 2023. It's a papyrus Oxyrhynchus 5575. And this is one of the most interesting pieces of, so this is before the official canonization of the Gospels, and this is a quotation from I think it's the book of Matthew, the book of Luke, and the Gospel of Thomas. Now, this is interesting because there is this sort of presentation that orthodoxy was sort of this gradual idea that over time people came to see the clarity and the truth thereof. Nothing could be further from the truth. As the Nag Hammadi documents themselves have shown, which were ostensibly buried by Egyptian Orthodox monks, Coptic monks, these texts were loved and venerated and studied and considered to be part of a practice. And as orthodoxy becomes more and more centralized and more risky to oppose, we do find a certain shortening of a lot of these behaviors. But it's very important to know that this was not happening all at once, and that people whom we would consider to be part of the Orthodox camp or part of the Gnostic camp often had cross affiliations, and people venerated them or found importance in them. Even Origen, who's a doctor of the church. Origen is thoroughly influenced by a lot of Gnostic theology. So that's very important to remember. And that this distinction was not simple. Gnostic texts, such as the Nag Hammadi scrolls, as I said, were composed by Orthodox monks. Christian families copied, adored, and kept unorthodox Bibles and different books. And some of these books were so incredibly popular that they sort of form this extra canonical basis. And one of the most famous of this is the Shepherd of Hermas, which is one of the most widely circulated texts in the Christian world. And while it is not explicitly Gnostic, it is indeed highly, uh, I guess you'd call spiritualized. It's definitely a text written with strong apocalyptic overtones. And people read it, as well as the Book of Enoch, as well as, there's numerous other accounts. And the Book of Enoch was being read in 14th century Rome. I mean, sorry, in 14th century Florence, because we find references to it in Dante. So again, even after the establishment of the canon, people still found these books important. And in point of fact, one of the oldest Christian tradition, the Ethiopian tradition, actually includes several of them, which were later excluded by church councils. So that's very important. And this was not a transition without pain for many of the people involved in the process. Particularly the Gospel of Thomas had strong support by many of the followers of the church. And it only lost its canonical status through a very small margin and basically through a domination of the history thereof. But it is very important. And we find a similar pattern of gradual change over time and not a sort of triumphant victory. This comes out also in understanding the conversion to Islam, particularly by a lot of former Christians who convert to Islam during the Arab conquest. We see this in the Cathar movement, where people were reading Cathar literature in the Languedoc, and then they were sharing that literature amongst themselves. And they preserved it even after many of the formal Cathars had been destroyed. And we've even seen some of this in particularly the Radical Reformation, which we're going to learn so much more about this later this autumn. So I hope everyone's ready for that. However, by pointing to the length of time for new interpretive traditions to flower, and this is quite shortly, Paul's text can be read, as well as others' works whose actual interpretation was in a state of flux, with different elements. Um, these are each part of distinct historical moments. And we should always do our best to try to remember that although we have the canon as it exists now, there were many ways that it could have gone, and varying different interpretive structures. And thus, as you say, when I was pointing out the history of the Gospel of Thomas, there was a 20-year period in which people read it and accepted it, and then there are decrees coming in from Chalcedon and various other places that are pushing back against it. And there are arguments going on back and forth, and then it's all part of this history that's sort of been lost to us, and we have to do our best to sort of reclaim. And I think it's also very important, and I mentioned this earlier, is that even if Paul was not himself an actual Gnostic, whatever that meant, he was read and interpreted by some who were of that tradition, and at the very least, they found his work to be conducive to their own theological projects. And furthermore, since these movements arise almost 100 years after Paul, he most likely, and I say this with a certain degree of certainty, he would have taken some issue with their interpretation, even though I also think he would have recognized the source of a lot of their information, a lot of their opinions, which was his own. So today, because this is such a complicated chapter, we're only going to discuss two of these. And we can go, and these, so what we're going to be talking about is inner transformation and the way that Paul's particular interpretation of the Hebrew law changes or sort of gives birth to later, particularly demiurgic forms of Gnosticism. And depending upon how far we want to go in this, I have an entire bibliography about that particular question, the second component. But let's go to the next slide, Karen. Okay, so inner transformation is essential to Paul's message. We find in Romans 12, verse 2, a very famous verse. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your minds, so that you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. Now, that particular moment, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind. This is automatically, we're dealing with a different perspective on what transformation means and upon what right orthopraxis, right behavior mean. These have been very clearly defined, or truthfully, many of the texts that are clearly defining these for Pharisaic Judaism are contemporary with these events. But it is interesting that with the rise of Paul's interpretation of what the law meant in the Jewish sense, this caused the rabbis to really do a certain degree of soul searching on their own to try to understand, well, what is it that he's misunderstanding? And I think that that's sort of a polemic argument that's very interesting. And then we also have in Galatians 1:1, again, one of the most fantastic verses. Paul, an apostle, sent neither by the human commission nor from human authorities, but through Jesus Christ and God the Father who raised him from the dead. Now, this is a particularly interesting point because this is a trans-historical point. Paul is not saying that, Paul is specifically putting the people who knew Jesus into a secondary level because his commission came not from men, which I think is sort of interesting when you try to understand, what exactly his Christology was. Because I certainly don't think Peter would have been called of men either, if you understand the divine nature of Jesus. But he is saying that there is a moment at which he was called to these things. And he was not called by any human being, he was called by God himself. And thus, there have been many different Christian movements throughout history that have taken this particular line and this particular type of thinking to their own perspectives, the Mormon perspectives, etc. So inner transformation we see, and let's go to the next slide. And sort of in complement to a lot of this, I've included from the Gospel of Thomas, which was written between 60 and 140 AD, so roughly contemporary of the same time when they're putting together the Pauline interpretation. So we have this sort of phrase, which is very interesting, and it plays with this notion between the physical world and the spiritual world, and what requires to be a part of the spiritual world. It said, if those who lead you say, see, the kingdom is in the sky, then the birds of the sky will precede you. If they say it is in the sea, the fish will precede you. Rather, the kingdom is inside you and is outside you. Very, very beautiful, I think. Really stunning. And the Gospel of Thomas also says, if you bring forth what is within you, what you have will save you. And both of these are very influenced by Paul's own conversion story, where he breaks the certain historical moment to say that no, there's in fact something much, much deeper that's going on here. Next slide, Karen. But as interesting as that sort of element is, and I think that at some point, maybe in the future after we finish the Paul series, but we can go back and we can examine what that means in terms of inner transformation, because there is no consistent depiction of that particular formation throughout the Gospels. But what's much more important in this particular moment, when we're trying to understand Paul's influence on the Gnostic, in particular dualistic circles, we have to understand the way he sees the Jewish law and what that does for the cosmos. And I think this is very important because the way that he depicts the Jewish law also is the groundwork for dividing the Godhead and trying to say that there is a distinction between the God of Israel, who gave the laws, and the God of Jesus Christ. And I think that's intimately connected to this way that he is describing and distinguishing the Hebrew Bible. So, what is this? So, this is based on natural versus spiritual, that dichotomy, and the nature of the law. For Paul, law is not a resolute image to maintain correct spiritual connection with the God of the Hebrew Bible. It is rather a schoolmaster, which is to show the moral bankruptcy of the human being. And now let us consider the next slide. So this is from the book of Romans, chapter 3, because as I've said, there is a polemic that's going on here. And Hebrew writers are very offended by the way Paul is handling this, so they're writing their own text in opposition to a lot of the Christian interpretation. But we'll start here. So Paul says, no, not at all, for we have already charged that all, both Jews and Greeks, are under the power of sin. That's 9. Now I go to 19. Now we know that whatever the law says, it speaks to those who are under the law, so that every mouth may be silenced, and the whole world may be held accountable to God. For no human being will be justified in his sight by deeds prescribed by the law, for through the law comes the knowledge of sin. Without doubt, this is one of the most radical Jewish statements that could have ever been made by a Jew. And fundamentally, it presents a view of the Torah, of the prescribed law, as producing the knowledge of sin. This is in stark contradistinction to most Jewish attitudes about what is taking place in the law. And to understand those, I've included two different phrases. So let's go back 2 slides, Karen. So the first one comes from the Pirkei Avot, which is in the Midrash. And it is, as again, relatively contemporary to the time of Paul. Actually, a little bit earlier. So roughly, so before the destruction in 70 AD of the temple. So the law, is a tree of life to those who take hold of it, and those who hold fast to it are blessed. So that's a very different perspective. It's not something that gives damnation or destruction. Rather, it is something that instructs, teaches, and guides. And this is based very closely on something called the Deuteromistic interpretation of the law, which comes from the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 30, verse 19. I have set before you life and death, blessing and a curse. Choose life so that you and your offspring may live. So Paul's understanding of the law. So Paul is presenting a radical severance between the law as guide or teacher of appropriate behavior, something that sanctifies the community of Israel to continue to maintain direct and lively fellowship with the God of the universe. So he's changing that into something that's basic purpose is to serve as judge, jury, and executioner, to bring forth the idea of fundamental judgment. And he argues that the law is a condemning judge and that it exposes sin and renders humanity incapable of achieving right standing with the Lord. And this is in absolute opposition to what is presented in the Hebrew sacrificial system, which is aimed exactly at showing how God and his people are to adhere with one another. And there is also this idea that the law somehow transcends what is behavioral to mean something, the weight that you carry internally, which is again a very strange interpretation of Jewish tradition, particularly in a time when the sacrificial system was still going on. The law was very clear about how you got to right standing. You followed the sacrificial procedures. You forgave people. I mean, there were clear ways of sort of regaining this life. As Roshi points out, is in the next slide, Karen. So this is Rashi. His life was between 1040 and 1150 AD. He's considered to be one of the greatest Jewish commentators on the scriptures. So in his commentary, and I don't remember where I found this really, it was from a sort of a, I think this is from a Jewish scholar in the Chabad movement, but I should find that out. So in his commentary on the biblical command, choose life, Rashi emphasized that the curses presented in the Torah are not irrevocable sentences, but conditional warnings meant to encourage self-reflection and repentance. By highlighting that the command is an invitation to actively choose life, Rashi implicitly refutes any interpretation that would see the Torah's legal framework as solely a means to damning sinners. This reading underlines that the Torah is a living document, a tree of life designed to guide its adherents toward ethical and spiritual growth. And I think that many times a serious distinction and cause of conflict in dealing with the Jewish tradition is that Christians fundamentally misunderstand the way Jews appropriate the law. And that misunderstanding comes from Paul himself. Radical statement, I know, but it's there. Okay, let's go to the next slide, but then the next one. So the Torah was not written primarily as a punitive force in rabbinic dualism, but as a communal and covenantal guide, a means to foster moral growth, community identity, and a relationship with God, an actual vital relationship in which you continue the work of God on earth. The Jewish view sees the law as redemptive and instructive, intended to guide believers toward ethical living, rather than condemn. For Paul, the entire cosmos had become so intensely fallen, which is again a very strange idea considering normative Judaism, that only a cataclysmic reordering would offer salvation to anyone. However, it is not Paul's Judaism on display in these documents, but rather a specific type of apocalyptic spirituality which combined prophetic utterance from the prophets. When you look at if you go to a Jewish temple or a Jewish synagogue, you see the Torah, so the 5 books, the Ketuvim and the Netuvim. These are the prophets. These are the writings. And they are not at the same level as the Torah, because the Torah stands alone, but they are commentaries that have been, over centuries, acknowledged as accurate commentaries by holy men inspired by God. So it's taking this element, this sort of apocalyptic element, and it's combining it with Greek philosophy. And as when we talked about Paul the Hellenist, he was incredibly familiar with Greek philosophy. And one of the particular traditions that very much informs his reading of the law comes from Socrates. And the Cratylus this was written between 380 and 360 BC. This was in Plato's middle period. It is devoted to analyzing the etymology of the word soma, body, and that's actually a cognate. The same word actually is in Sanskrit. So it's an Indo-European language term. And he makes explicit this pun between soma and sema. And sema means prison. So Socrates wears his more playful hat, and he engages in a sort of speculative wordplay to uncover the supposed original meaning of different words. And this is actually sort of an esoteric history of language. And he notes that some say that the body is a grave, sima, of the soul, as if the soul were buried in it. Alternatively, he adds, because the soul signals its thought through the body's actions, sima could also mean a sign. But Socrates then expresses his own preference. And he says, I think that it was the followers of Orpheus who gave it this name, seeking that the soul is undergoing a punishment, and that the body is an enclosure to keep it safe. Soma, in the sense of being preserved or being set apart. In Greek, soma resembles the verb sozo, to save and to preserve, to set apart. So Socrates cleverly suggests that the body might also be called soma because the soul is kept safe in it, like a guarded prison. However, this type of thought is quite different than normative Judaism in any way that we would understand it. So, what is the difference? So, spirit and body in the vast history of Jewish philosophy are emphatically unified, and to separate either is an abomination in the sense that it's unnatural, unjust, and should not be. Now, a spirit without a body is a ghost, and if anyone can remember, in the Gospels where Jesus appears after, he tells them, he says, I am not a ghost. I have flesh and blood, as you see. So that's written from a very strongly Jewish perspective that the only ideal being on the earth has both physical body and spirit. And that to try to distinguish them is really quite antithetical to the Jewish worldview. But Paul leans heavily into this language, going not only so far as to suggest that there can be a difference. Oh, and let's go to the next slide, Karen. But he actually says that there is a strong preference for the spiritual over the earthly, and that the two are in a conflict. And he actually talks about this in terms of the principalities and dominations of the devil and the Lord of this world. In Judaism, there is only one Lord of this world, and that is the Lord. There is no room for another. And this is one reason why several early Jewish sources accuse early Christians of having two gods. They say, well, they don't worship the other one, but they talk about him. They talk about him as being a god because he has all this power in the physical world. And I think that when you start seeing this distinction that Paul lays upon the moral world of Judaism and this sort of vision that he has, I think what is so clear is that one sort of gives birth to the other. Because if you distinguish between the law, which used to be life-giving, life-affirming, world-affirming, into something that is tyrannical and dominating, how is this different from what Marcion of Sinope, our good friend that we've talked about numerous times here, just for dates, he lived between 85 and 160 AD. He writes this, that we have through heresiologists, if the law be valid, meaning the Torah law, then the death of Christ is in vain. So if you can receive anything out of the law, of the biblical law, then that inherently nullifies the death of Jesus. That's a profoundly Pauline statement. Now, one of the most important works that sort of present this cosmologically, this distinction between the ruler of this world and the Hebrew Bible, is the hypostasis of the archons. And we know this only survived in Coptic translation, and we only found it in 1948. But the hypostasis of the archons, again, 2nd, 3rd century, thoroughly imbued with both Pauline logic and that of Marcion of Sinope. So just two quick quotations. Then the chief ruler, meaning the demiurge, and he said, I am God, and there is no one else, no other God beside me. This led William Blake to say, well, is this a God a boaster then? And you clearly see that this is playing with the Hebrew depiction. And we have the second quote. And he said, I'm a jealous God, and there is no other God beside me. But by announcing this, he indicated to the angels who attended him that there must exist another God. Very, very interesting point. The presence of, so this is all rooted in Paul's reworking of the concept of the law, and I would actually say his violence to the traditional Jewish understanding, because there's very little of Judaism in Paul's description of the law. And this particular question about Marcion. So Marcion had a wide array of followers, particularly in Valentinian Gnosticism, as well as in various forms of Marcionite Christianity. And he taught fundamentally that the creation of the physical world was not done by the transcendent God and Father of Jesus Christ, but rather a demiurge. And demiurge, which we really should talk about at some other point, but that's a Platonic construct, which comes actually not firstly out of Plato, it comes from, it actually arises in Mystikoi writings. But this idea that there is a fashioner. In the Platonic and Greek context, the deity is not necessarily evil. And he's not universally despised as evil in any main Gnosticism, although there are some. More so vain and sort of aloof, unaware, this kind of thing. So the law, according to Marcion, was therefore based around this deity, and because of this sort of history, we find in the second to the fourth centuries inclusions. Now, this is from the anti-Marcionite prologue to the Gospel of Luke. But it's very important that you realize that there were also anti-Marcionite prologues in Mark and in John. These were not preserved in the Protestant Bible for a variety of reasons, mostly that they came from the Vulgate. But let's just read these things here. So indeed, Luke was an Antiochian Syrian, a doctor by profession, a disciple of the apostles. Later, however, he followed Paul until his martyrdom, serving the Lord blamelessly. He never had a wife, he never fathered children, and died at the age of 84, full of the Holy Spirit in Boeotia. Therefore, although Gospels had already been written indeed by Matthew in Judea and by Mark in Italy, moved by the Holy Spirit, he wrote down the Gospel in the parts of Achaia, signifying in the preface that the others were written before his, but also that it was the greatest importance for him to expound with greatest diligence the whole series of events in his narration for the Greek believers. So, and this is the key point, so that they would not be led astray by the lure of Jewish fables, or seduced by the fables of heretics and stupid solicitations fall away from the truth. There is a particular element here, which is much more explicit in the Gospel of John, which I should have included, which actually names the prologue to the Gospel of John, actually calls on Marcion. But Marcion was certainly by this time the most well-known heretic, and so seems to be the one being referred to here. Also, this is sort of underscored by highlighting Luke's never being married, etc., which were both important things for Marcion. And we also find here, later the Apostle John wrote the Apocalypse on the island of Patmos and then the Gospel in Asia. So the Gospel in Asia, what does that mean? We are quite confused by that. There's no scholarly consensus, and this just sort of shows you the ways in which people were playing polemics well into the development of the canon. Now, so to clarify, and let's go to the next slide, Karen. So to clarify all of this in a very specific way, and I realize that this has been a lot today, but you're good for it. I want to read something from Pagels, and this is sort of a interpretation. She's working predominantly in terms of the Valentinian Gnosticism, but I want to just show just a little bit of an extended reading of how certain Gnostics would have interpreted the writings of Paul and build upon what Paul had already said. So in the book of Romans, chapter 1, verse 1, Paul says, Paul, slave of Jesus Christ, called apostle, separated for the gospel of God. Paul opened, and this is quotes from, all of this comes from 13 to 15 of Pagel's book. Paul opens his letter indicating his dual responsibility, his dual identity. So Valentinian exegetes might claim, for the apostle first identified himself as slave of Jesus Christ, that is, as a psychic, standing as a slave in relation to the pneumatic revelation. All of these are going to be discussed next session. So Paul identifies himself physically a second time when he says he's called, by contrast with the pneumatikois, who are chosen. Yet paradoxically, he goes on to identify himself as one separated from the gospel of God. Separated for, not separated of, separated for the gospel of God. Valentinian exegetes correlate this passage with his praise for the one who separated me from my mother's womb, and that's in Galatians 1:15. Seizing upon this passage, Origen says, to prove that Paul is of the pneumatic elect, the apostle, they explain, uses the symbolic language to reveal that he has been born from God the Father above, through the mother, who is the wisdom, or Sophia, or grace. So why does Paul, the great pneumatic teacher, identify himself first as a mere psychic slave? Theodotus, citing Philemon 2, 7 and 9, recalls how the pneumatic Christ emptied himself to take on the psychic form of a slave. Jesus, that being found in human likeness, he might become accessible to psychics, or those who are on the lesser stage of spiritual development. As a slave, Paul imitates Christ. He, although chosen, identifies himself voluntarily with those who are called. The gospel of, and this is again chapter 1 of Romans 3 and 4, the gospel of God concerning his Son, who came into existence of the seed of David, according to the flesh, the one designated Son of God, in power according to the Spirit. Paul now demonstrates how he preaches the gospel of God in two different forms. First, he proclaims the one who came in existence of the seed of David according to the flesh, and the second, the one designated Son of God according to the Spirit. What does this mean? Does he refer first to the Savior's human lineage, and second to his divine lineage, the Creator? So, in the Valentinian understanding, they reject this literal exegesis, and they actually say that Paul is speaking symbolically, with David referring to the demiurge, an appropriate metaphor first, and that he dominates his creature like any petty king, and second, so that as the demiurge, he has formed and fathered mankind according to the flesh. And that phrase, according to the flesh, is thoroughly Pauline. It's thoroughly imbued in a certain type of apocalyptic, but it's very alien to a lot of Jewish thinking. So then the psychic preaching of the Savior according to the flesh as the son of the demiurge, i.e. of David, but in the fourth verse of the first chapter, we find the noetic proclamation of Christ according to the Spirit as one designated Son of God, of the true Father. Now that was, as I've said, a very, and I actually didn't read as much as I thought I was going to, but I feel like that's a pretty good introduction, and that's a pretty good stopping point for how that we're going to talk about the second elements. So notably how Paul uses the term flesh, how we have to sort of understand the kind of audience that he's describing and he's defining for his readers. And secondly, the way that other thinkers, particularly in the radical Protestant tradition, will take this on. And I'm speaking specifically of Calvin. But with that, we can go ahead and copy the, we're going to go ahead and, let's go ahead and break into the discussion group, and we can stop the recording.